I mean, I consider it a personal victory if I make it up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment without needing to literally sit down and catch my breath.
Right. Yeah, I know the feeling.
So I want you to imagine for just a second, standing in the Ladakh region of India. You are sitting at about 3,500 to maybe 5,500 meters above sea level.
Which is, what, over 18,000 feet at the high end?
Exactly. Over 18,000 feet. The air is freezing, often dropping to like minus 20 degrees Celsius. The solar radiation is just beating down on you because the atmosphere is so incredibly thin up there.
Yeah, there's no protection.
Right. And there is barely any vegetation around. It's just this vast, barren, but breathtakingly rugged landscape. But the thing is, the most dangerous part about this place isn't the cold or the sun. It's actually the air itself.
Yeah, because every single breath you take up there, it delivers only a tiny fraction of the oxygen you're used to getting at sea level. Biologically speaking, it is a state of chronic hypobaric hypoxia, which basically just means severely low oxygen pressure. It's an incredibly hostile environment that honestly should shut down the biological machinery of most mammals.
It really should. And yet, this region is just teeming with native wildlife.
It is.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are digging into this fascinating research to understand how certain animals, specifically the really remarkable indigenous Ladakhi cattle, have evolved these biological mechanisms to, well, not just survive on the roof of the world, but actively thrive there.
Yeah, and to really appreciate what these cattle are doing, we have to separate what happens to you or me at high altitude versus what is actually happening to them.
Okay, break that down for us.
So if you travel to the Trans-Himalayas tomorrow, your body undergoes acclimatization. That's just a series of, temporary physiological adjustments. Your breathing rate shoots up, your heart works a lot harder, and maybe over a few weeks, your body produces more red blood cells to desperately capture whatever oxygen is floating around.
But if I fly back down to sea level, all of those temporary emergency measures basically just reverse themselves, right? My body goes back to normal.
Exactly. It's totally reversible. But what we are looking at with the Ladakhi cattle is true evolutionary adaptation. These are permanent, irreversible genetic changes.
Wow.
They've accumulated over countless generations through the pretty ruthless filter of natural selection. It is permanently written into their DNA.
And for the Trans-Himalayan communities living in Leh and Ladakh, this genetic coding is quite literally a lifeline. I mean, the local economy, their livelihood, their nutrition, it all depends on these specific animals.
Oh, absolutely. They can subsist on extremely poor quality fodder while withstanding environmental stress that would absolutely devastate a standard crossbred cow imported from the plains.
Right, but the scientific mystery here is how they actually do it. Because when you look at a Ladakhi cow, it doesn't look like some alien creature. It doesn't have massive ballooning lungs on the outside of its body.
Right, no visible superpowers.
Exactly. The adaptations are invisible.
Yeah.
So to find the answer, researchers realized they had to look at the microscopic activity of literally thousands of genes simultaneously.
And to understand why they did that, we should probably talk about why oxygen is the ultimate biological currency, just to ground this in how the body actually works.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Think of oxygen as the essential fuel supplied to the engine of your body. Like every single cell requires that oxygen to generate energy through a process called cellular respiration.
Right, and without getting, too lost in the biochemistry, cellular respiration is just how cells turn nutrients into usable energy. Oxygen is the critical final piece of that assembly line.
So if that oxygen fuel runs low, the assembly line stops.
Basically, yeah. And the cellular engine is in real danger of just stalling out completely. When oxygen is severely limited, the cells must fundamentally rewire their operations to keep the organism alive.
And to see that rewiring in action, the researchers in this study looked at something called the transcriptome. I actually love the analogy they used to explain this.
The library one?
Yes. So if you imagine the genome, the entire DNA, as a massive physical library containing every single instruction manual for the entire body, the genome never really changes. It's a whole building.
Right, it's static.
But the transcriptome is different. The transcriptome represents only the specific books that are currently opened, laid out on the table, and being actively read by the cell at a specific moment in time.
Yeah, and the dynamic nature of the transcriptome is exactly what makes it so incredibly useful to study. The genome sits there, but the transcriptome shifts constantly based on what the cell needs right now.
So by reading the transcriptome, scientists can see exactly which genes are switched on, right?
Exactly. The ones switched on are what we call upregulated, and the ones switched off are downregulated. So they can see this whole shifting landscape when an animal is facing chronic hypoxia.
I do have a fundamental question about how they set this up, though. If we are looking at a problem involving breathing and oxygen deprivation, I would just assume researchers would, I don't know, biopsy lung tissue.
Sure, that makes sense intuitively.
Or maybe muscle tissue, since muscles demand so much oxygen. But they didn't do that. They extracted peripheral blood mononuclear cells, or
Right.
PBMCs. Why blood cells?
Well, it comes down to both accessibility and the really unique role of those specific cells. PBMCs are circulating immune cells, things like T cells and B cells,
Right.
and because they're constantly flowing throughout the entire bloodstream, visiting literally every corner of the body, they act as the body's rapid response scouts.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they are highly sensitive indicators of overall physiological stress, oxygen availability, and inflammation. If the entire body is in a state of hypoxic panic, the PBMCs will vividly reflect that in their transcriptome.
Plus, I'd imagine drawing blood is just far less invasive for the cattle than trying to take lung biopsies.
Oh, 100%. Much easier on the animals.
So we have the target blood cells. Now we need a comparison. Because to figure out what makes the Ladakhi cattle's genetic reading material so special, the researchers needed to compare them to a breed living at sea level.
Right, and they chose the Sahiwal cattle. Now, Sahiwal cattle are a highly resilient indigenous breed in their own right.
But they live in a very different environment.
Exactly. They're completely adapted to the tropical, low altitude, and normoxic, meaning normal oxygen conditions of places like Punjab and Haryana.
So the experiment basically pits the freezing thin air mountains against the hot, thick air tropics.
Right, it's the setup, yeah.
And to compare them, they extracted RNA from the blood cells and ran it through this thing called an adjuvant 44K bovine microarray.
Which sounds very sci-fi.
It does.
Yeah.
But think of this microarray and a massive, incredibly complex control board with over 43,000 tiny light switches on it.
Right.
Each switch represents a specific gene probe. When they watch the genetic material over this board, it instantly shows which genes are glowing brightly, meaning they are active, and which ones are totally dark.
And researchers are scanning that massive control board specifically for differentially expressed genes, or DEGs.
Differentially expressed genes? Okay, what's the best way to visualize that?
Think of gene expression like the workforce in a massive factory. On a normal, sunny Tuesday, everyone is just doing their standard job, right?
Yeah.
But suddenly, a catastrophic blizzard hits. Differential expression shows how the factory radically reprioritizes. Some workers are told to go into absolute overdrive, working double shifts just to keep the heating system running.
And the others?
Meanwhile, the workers painting the walls or landscaping outside are told to stop completely and just go on standby.
Okay. That brings us to the actual data. And the sheer scale of the reprioritization in these cows is just wild.
It really is. Comparing the Ladakhi cattle to the Sahiwal cattle, that microarray identified a total of 8,417 differentially expressed genes.
Over 8,000.
Yeah. And even when the researchers applied a very strict filter looking only for genes that were working at least twice as hard or half as hard, they still isolated 3,910 significantly altered genes.
Okay, give me the breakdown of those 3,910 genes, because this is the part that completely challenged my assumption of how evolution actually works.
I love this part. So, of those significantly altered genes, 1,207 were upregulated, meaning turned up in the Ladakhi cattle.
Okay.
But a massive 2,703 genes were downregulated, meaning they were actively turned down or switched off entirely.
Wait, so more than double the genes were turned off compared to what was turned on?
Yep.
That is crazy to me. I always pictured high-altitude adaptation as, I don't know, gaining a superpower? You know, flipping a switch to activate some magical mountain climbing ability.
Right, like putting on a jetpack.
Exactly. But this data shows that surviving extreme environments is actually mostly about turning things off.
Well, it's all about biological energy. Energy is a finite resource. You cannot simply turn every survival mechanism on without completely depleting your reserves. High-altitude hypoxia has a profound, sweeping down-regulatory effect on the animal's overall biology.
I see.
The Ladakhi cattle aren't brute-forcing their way through the thin air, you know?
Yeah.
They are operating with extreme genetic economy.
Genetic economy. I like that. But they do turn some critical things on, right? Those are the factory workers going into overdrive. Let's look at the survival kit they actually activated. I know there's one specific gene that acts like the foreman of the whole operation.
Oh, yeah. The absolute star player in this physiological response is a gene called HIF1 alpha. That stands for hypoxia-inducible factor 1 alpha. In the Ladakhi cattle, this single gene was upregulated over 15-fold compared to the tropical Sahiwal cattle.
Over 15 times more active.
Oh.
So how does a gene actually, know that the cow is running out of oxygen? How does HIF1 alpha sense the thin air?
The mechanism is actually brilliant. In a normal environment with plenty of oxygen, the cell is constantly producing the HIF1 alpha protein.
About
But the presence of oxygen actively tags this protein for immediate destruction. It's as if the factory is constantly building a fire alarm, but dismantling it immediately because there's no fire.
Oh, wow, that's a great way to put it.
Right. However, the moment oxygen levels drop, that destruction process stops. The HIF1 alpha protein survives, it accumulates, and travels into the center of the cell, the nucleus, where it starts pulling all the emergency levers to maintain oxygen balance.
So the lack of oxygen is literally the trigger that allows the survival protein to live and do its job.
Precisely. And once HIF1 alpha enters the nucleus, it triggers a massive cascade of secondary responses. It fundamentally changes both the plumbing and the fuel consumption of the cell.
Let's talk about the plumbing first, because obviously the body has to maximize whatever tiny amount of oxygen is actually in the blood.
Right.
So HIF1 alpha activates a family of genes responsible for producing nitric oxide. And one of them, NOS2, was upregulated over 17-fold. Now, nitric oxide acts as a vasodilator. It essentially signals the smooth muscles around the blood vessels to relax.
Which is quite literally widening the pipes.
Exactly. So the blood can flow faster, with less resistance, to the tissues that are just starving for oxygen.
And widening the pipes is step one. But if the existing delivery network still isn't enough, HIF1 alpha triggers another incredible mechanism. It upregulates a family of genes responsible for vascular endothelial growth factors, or VEGF.
Growth factors. So it's actively building something.
It is instructing the body to build brand new blood vessels. It's a biological process known as angiogenesis. The Ladakhi cattle's DNA recognizes that the highway system is inadequate for the current oxygen delivery quotas, so it basically forces the tissue to construct more roads.
Widen the pipes, build new pipes. That handles the delivery side. But you can deliver all the blood in the world, and if the cells can't burn their fuel properly because there isn't enough oxygen to run that cellular respiration assembly line we talked about, the engine still stalls.
Right, you need fuel.
So how do they get energy?
Well, they completely rewrite their metabolism. The
Yeah.
researchers saw massive upregulation in specific metabolic genes. Things like EPS1, which was up almost 20-fold, along with glucose transporters and enzymes like HK2 and GLUT1.
Okay, and what do those do?
They shift the cell away from normal oxygen-based energy production. Instead, they push the cell toward a process called anaerobic glycolysis.
Anaerobic, meaning without oxygen.
Exactly. It's a way of burning glucose for fuel when oxygen is scarce. Now, in most animals, anaerobic glycolysis is a very short-term emergency backup.
Like when you sprint.
Right. If you sprint as fast as you can, your muscles run out of oxygen and switch to this process, which produces lactic acid. That's the intense burning sensation you feel in your legs that eventually forces you to stop.
Yeah, we've all felt that.
But the Ladakhi cattle have upregulated genes that allow them to rely heavily on this oxygen-free energy production continuously, while somehow efficiently managing the byproducts.
So they are essentially running their biological engines on an entirely different combustion setting, tailored perfectly for 18,000 feet. But I want to circle back to the genetic economy we touched on earlier, because this is fascinating. The Ladakhi cattle turned off 2,703 genes. If they are pouring all this energy into widening blood vessels and rewriting their metabolism, what exactly are they shutting down to save power?
To answer that, we have to look at the microarray board for the Sahiwal cattle.
The tropical ones.
Right. Remember, those thousands of genes are off in the mountains, but they were glowing brightly for the cattle living down at sea level. The researchers found that the most heavily upregulated genes in the tropical Sahiwal cattle were almost entirely dedicated to the immune system and aggressive inflammatory responses.
Really? What kind of immune responses are we talking about?
We are talking about things like EEF1A1, which was upregulated a staggering 84-fold in the Sahiwal.
84-fold.
Yeah, and we see a massive overproduction of chemokines like GRO1 and CXCL2. These are chemical signals that induce a strong immune response by calling white blood cells to the site of an infection. We also see high levels of defensins like DEFB3, which are essentially frontline antimicrobial weapons used to destroy bacteria and viruses. The Sahiwal cattle's immune system is essentially operating on a wartime footing at all times.
Wow. But when you picture the two environments, that makes total sense, doesn't it?
It really does.
Think about a tropical environment like the plains of Punjab. It is hot, it is humid, and it is just a paradise for diverse pathogens, bacteria, ticks, and parasites.
Yeah, life is everywhere down there.
The Sahiwal cattle have to keep their immune factory workers on constant high alert standby just to survive the sheer volume of microscopic threats.
But the Trans-Himalayas present the exact opposite environment. Ladakh is a freezing, harsh, cold desert. The environmental conditions are so severe that the pathogen load is drastically lower.
It's too cold for the bugs.
Exactly. It is, by comparison, a highly sterile environment. Bacteria and parasites simply struggle to survive up there.
So it's the ultimate evolutionary trade-off. Running a massive, highly active immune system requires a tremendous amount of calories and biological energy.
A huge amount.
The Ladakhi cattle don't need a standing army because there are no invaders. So they basically lay off the soldiers and use that energy to keep the heating on and fix the pikes.
They are actively and elegantly down-regulating immune pathways to save vital energy. If a Ladakhi cow wasted energy fighting non-existent tropical parasites, it simply wouldn't have the metabolic reserves to maintain its altered breathing and blood flow. It would either freeze or suffocate.
It makes you wonder what else they don't need to deal with up there. I mean, at minus 20 degrees, they certainly aren't struggling to stay cool.
Which is precisely why the researchers also noted a massive downregulation in heat shock proteins in the Ladakhi cattle.
What do those do?
Heat shock proteins act as molecular chaperones, helping other proteins maintain their proper shape when an animal is exposed to intense environmental heat. The Sahiwal cattle need them desperately to survive the tropical sun, but the Ladakhi cattle simply turn those genetic switches off.
Every single biological switch has a metabolic cost and a survival benefit. It's really astonishing how perfectly calibrated they are.
It is. The deeper we look at the transcriptome, the more we realize that high-altitude adaptation is not some single lucky mutation. It is a comprehensive, incredibly elegant restructuring of the entire cellular economy.
Yeah.
Both breeds have beautifully optimized their internal instruction manuals to match the specific rooms they've lived in over millennia. The Sahiwal is a master of fighting heat and disease. The Ladakhi is a master of thriving in thin air and freezing cold.
It really redefines survival of the fittest, doesn't it? It's not about being the strongest, most heavily armored animal in a vacuum. It's about being the most perfectly tailored to the specific threats of your environment.
And that tailoring is written in a language of 43,000 gene switches.
It's just incredible. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave you with one final, mind-expanding idea drawn straight from this study. It's something that hints at a much larger pattern in nature.
The cross-species pathways. It's such a fascinating observation.
Yes. The researchers noted that the specific molecular mechanisms altered in these Ladakhi cattle, specifically a biological relay system called the NAPK signaling pathway.
Which essentially passes environmental stress signals down a chain of proteins to trigger a cellular response.
Right. Well, these are the exact same pathways modified in other high-altitude survivors. We were talking about Tibetan antelopes. We were talking about yaks.
Which are completely different species.
Completely different. The researchers even found identical pathway modifications in the ground tit, which is literally a species of bird living on the Tibetan plateau.
It suggests a really remarkable evolutionary convergence.
It does. So I leave you with this to ponder as you picture that freezing, barren, thin air landscape. Does nature have a universal high-altitude playbook hidden in the DNA of completely different species, just waiting for the mountains to force them to read the page?